If you play and love live service games, then eventually, inevitably, the game you love will disappear. And on the one hand, you have to be okay with that. But on the other hand, maybe it doesn't always have to be that way. I originally started thinking about this when there's a lot of discussion sparked by Hero Siege going to Hero Siege 2.0 and essentially making all of the players unhappy, or at least almost all of them, as the reviews went from largely positive to about 90% negative after the update. Which on the one hand, I do want to say it's normal for a game that changes a lot to get some negative reviews and some pushback because change is uncomfortable. However, at 90%, it's pretty clear this update is not a step in the right direction, especially because even if the goal was to bring in more new players, it doesn't do a good job of that either. And if you want to know about some of the ways in which it doesn't do a good job of bringing in new players, check out my recent video, Worst RPG Ever, Hero Siege 2.0. And if you like gaming-related essays, guides, reviews, and much more, do be sure to get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, and buckle in because this is going to be a long one. But this got me thinking about the topic more broadly. Rather than just, why is Hero Siege 2 bad? Why is it a bad thing, or is it even a bad thing, if the games we love change over time? Most of the live service games I've played are not the same as they were 4 years ago. And 4 years from now, assuming the game continues to get development, they won't be the same either. This first happened to me with Runescape. I started Runescape right after Runescape transitioned from 1 to 2. And at the time, I was coming in as a completely fresh new player. So I didn't have any pre-existing expectations. This was the first MMO I had ever played, the first heavily online game I'd ever played, and the first game that was a sandbox, at least not counting things like Civ or simulation games. And so I found RuneScape 2 to be really cool, but I'm sure there are a portion of people who preferred the original. And those people played RuneScape Classic, at least for as long as Jagex supported it. But then around 2008, I started to fall out of love with RuneScape. The game had changed and moved away from the things that I felt like were the most interesting, exciting, or fun parts. The sense of community was slowly dissolving as people spent less time sitting in the Felidor Gardens trying to trade, and more time just buying things through the Grand Exchange. Because I noticed it was around this time that the game also started to become less social. More people were hanging out in their mumbles or their ventrilos rather than talking in the game chat. And I did that to an extent as well, spending quite a lot of time on Microsoft Messenger and AOL Messenger instead of talking in the game chat, but it definitely felt different. And I think it felt even more different for people when Jagex tried the evolution of combat, taking RuneScape from almost a auto-battler, old-school style game to a more modern action combat MMO style game. This was wildly unpopular, and it led to RuneScape 3, eventually, with fixes to the evolution of combat, and also old-school RuneScape, based off of a version that myself and many other people fell in love with back in around 2006 to 2008. With RuneScape 3, it's a modern game, and it's really easy to get into. I found this myself coming back to RuneScape after around a decade of not playing it. But old-school RuneScape has a lot more friction. It's not the easiest to get into, but does an amazing job of catering to the sort of mechanics that players wanted if they were a fan of RuneScape back in the day. But this does split the player base. And a lot of the time people say, oh, RuneScape 3 is dead, most players prefer old school RuneScape. So what if your game can't really be split like that? Let's say you're making an Overwatch or a Counterstrike Global Offensive. Well, we've seen Overwatch 2, which as a game, from what I've heard, is pretty good. It's still more or less Overwatch, but the systems around it, in particular the monetization, have not felt great and has led to a massive negative backlash. Or if you're a fan of CSGO and you spent a lot of time mastering the game, a lot of that doesn't apply in Counter-Strike 2. Or even a look at Path of Exile, a game which was originally inspired by Diablo 2, but evolved into something else wholly its own over the course of several years. And then GGG wanted to change Path of Exile yet again, to make it more accessible to new players, to bring in action combat inspirations from games like Dark Souls or Final Fantasy XVI. That sort of more engaging combat where the gameplay itself can keep you playing, rather than the thoughts about how many exalts you're getting, how many divines you're getting, or how cool your build's going to be with all of its mechanical interactions that then fall apart because you forgot one little thing. And when they started implementing aspects of PoE 2's design into PoE 1, players didn't like it. Some of that's because the changes needed a bit more work. They needed that extra fine-tuning, and a lot of the systems they changed at the time, like flasks and defenses, are in a much better spot now than they were before. Some of it's because many aspects of Path of Exile's 2 design was antithetical to Path of Exile 1. And GGG recognized that these two visions were fundamentally incompatible. So now they're going to take the risk, potentially split their player base, and have Path of Exile 1 and Path of Exile 2 developed side by side. Which I would say is the best possible outcome here. But that also brings us to Hero Siege, a game that started as a twin-stick shooter roguelike, and then it morphed into a Diablo-like game, focused on fast-paced gameplay, killing lots of monsters and grinding out your Paragon. So you could kind of think of it as an indie pixel Diablo 3. And that was the context that I originally heard about Hero Siege in. I didn't know too many of the details, but I heard it had pretty good couch co-op, and overall, it was fast-paced, easy to get into, and fun. But none of that is what I would use to describe the Hero Siege experience that I had. The movement is incredibly clunky. Skills tend to have high mana costs, requiring a decent amount of investment, at least on the Pyromancer. And the scaling makes absolutely no sense. It's an entirely different game, and a game that's full of friction, which, if you're going into it with no expectations, maybe you're told, hey, this game's really like Diablo 2. And by the way, a lot of the changes for Hero Siege 2.0 do seem to be copied straight from D2's homework with no rhyme or reason behind it. So if you're going into it as a new player, expecting it to be a Diablo 2 clone, I could see you being fairly happy with the game in its current version. But if you played before, I can absolutely understand why the game has a 90% negative review status right now, and so many players with 500 or 1,000 or 1,500 hours are unhappy. Now, in particular, one review stood out to me as accurately pinpointing a lot of the problems both that many existing players felt with Hero Siege, and also the ones that I encountered. And it comes from a shift of vision, a shift of what the game's supposed to be and who it's for. This is something that I think developers have to be really careful of, because in your goal to open the game up to new players, it's always very dangerous to alienate the existing players. And if you make the game only for existing players, filling it with in-jokes and references and obtuse mechanics that no one's going to get unless they've played forever, well, in both cases, I feel like it leads to a slow death. And I think that's probably what Hero Siege was experiencing. The game wasn't really growing all that much, but it had a stable community. And now that the developers made a drastic change, all of that has accelerated, and instead of a potential slow death, or a niche game that people really like, you have an incredibly rapid implosion where you've made nobody happy, and that's just not a good place to be. Hero Siege has always been a game with an identity crisis. I bought this game way back when it was a roguelite, not an ARPG hack and slash. Back then, there were no items, only relics as roguelites tend to have. It was enjoyable. But then one day, they decided to turn it into an ARPG, and slowly did. For the most part, they copied mechanics from Diablo 3, with no rhyme or reason behind it. No one really cared if the mechanics were good, or if they even worked in the first place in Diablo 3. As long as D3 did it, Hero Siege copied it. Ironically enough, Hero Siege managed to become a better game than D3 was ever capable of being, despite being a pixel graphics copycat. And I just want to stop in the review here for a minute and say that this review maybe doesn't give the developers quite enough credit in the way they're adapting Diablo 3. If it became a good game, which I think is fair to say, and if it became beloved, they were clearly doing something right. Through trial and error and gathering player feedback, they took the mechanics people liked from D3 and maybe excluded some of the ones they didn't. The reason it probably felt haphazard at the start, it's just that this process took some iteration or trial and error to actually get right. But continuing on. I'd say the game peaked a couple years ago, when it first introduced its auction house and mid-trading way easier. However, the bad part about peaking is that it's all downhill from there. The patches since, things kept getting reworked with no clear end goal. Mechanics kept getting more and more convoluted after each and every rework. The way heroes scaled changed completely several times with no gain whatsoever, and eventually the mythical Hero Siege 2.0 was announced. And what I'd like to highlight here is this feels like a developer communication problem. If players feel like mechanics are getting reworked for no reason at all, that's a failure of communication on the developers, because they might have a good reason. The end goal might be something a lot of players will agree with. And if players don't know what that end goal is, they very often can't effectively communicate the feedback on what about the current changes are or aren't working, which unfortunately tends to lead to a lot of hostility. Though I'd like to remind people that when it comes to giving constructive feedback on a game, hostility is never the answer. If you really think something is truly egregious, uninstall the game, stop playing it, and try to pursue a refund. Or if you've already been playing it for a long time, then maybe it's time to quit and move on to something else. But back to the review, let's see what it says about Hero Siege 2.0. Remember all those D3 mechanics that were copied? Gone. To ashes. They were no longer good enough. The new ideas? Copy Diablo 2. I shit you not, the game went from brainlessly copying one Diablo game to another. Why in the year of 2023 are we copying ideas and mechanics that were made with the consideration of the limitations of computers from the 1990s, or the lack of online guides/forums is beyond me. Why are runewords in the game? The original goal of runewords was to be a sort of Easter egg for a borderline pre-internet era. This is completely pointless in today's world. Why are we copying small potions from Diablo 2? I don't know a single person who thinks potion spamming is good game design. It was something that they went with 25 years ago. It was bad then and it's bad now. The difference is, back then it was trying something new, and now it's a joke. Why are we copying a 20-year-old UI from Diablo 2? Setting skills used to be simple. You click on a skill slot, you choose which skill you want there. Now you click on the one skill slot you have, and then you have to hover the skill, click your hidden by default keybind, and the skill is now keybound. And this is a section of a review that really resonated with me, because the copying of charms didn't make sense. The keybind stuff was completely obtuse to me. It didn't make sense, especially with how frequently runes were dropping, and also I didn't even know runewords existed until someone in my Discord told me they did through a menu, because the game never actually told me. And on the one hand, I would like to assume good intent from the developer, and say they have a vision for what they wanted the game to be. However, there are also a lot of very predatory monetization schemes that were introduced with the Hero Siege 2.0 change. Were charms added because they thought they were cool and an interesting thing about Diablo 2? Or were charms added to sell players extra inventory space? Is class balance poor because the developer had an idea that didn't pan out in reality? Or is class balance poor to encourage players to buy the paid classes that are just better than a lot of the free ones? And also something that I completely missed in my original review of the game, because luckily it is hidden in a menu, but they added loot boxes. And I do not understand why in 2023 companies are still stupid enough to add loot boxes to their games, or why governments are incompetent enough to not regulate loot boxes out of video games. Either way, it's very difficult to assume good developer intent when you see these player hostile decisions being made. If you want to make a game that has a lot of player friction, that's hard and genuinely uncomfortable for a lot of people to play, as a developer, that's fine, but you should clearly communicate that, and you shouldn't do it at the expense of what people already found fun without offering them an alternative. The developer should have let people play Hero Siege and Hero Siege 2.0 as two separate games, or at the very least with different versions via Steam, and provided at the very least support to keep Hero Siege running so people could play the game they enjoyed. But in failing to do that, effectively, Hero Siege is now a game for almost no one. And so that brings me back to my discussion from the top of the video. Are we doomed to lose the games we love? That if you love a live service game, whether it's RuneScape 3, old school RuneScape, Path of Exile, PoE 2 when it releases, League of Legends, World of Warcraft, Final Fantasy XIV, Hero Siege, maybe even something that's not necessarily a live service but does change a lot like Grim Dawn, Overwatch 2, or Counterstrike 2. Are you doomed to feel like the game is no longer for you at some point? Well, yes and no. Because on the one hand, I do think there's a time where people outgrow games. When I was younger, I had a lot of time, and not that much money. So I tended to play a lot of free online web games, and plenty of those were MMOs. Most of them weren't good, but I didn't care because it was free and online. I didn't need to download or install anything. And sometimes, even if your life circumstances don't change, you decide, I just don't want to go back to this game. I had my fun with it, and the magic, the spark, the feeling isn't there. And it's completely okay to do that or to feel that. Quitting a game isn't an inherently negative thing, nor is taking a break from a game. But I also think you have to consider when getting into one of these live services that it may not always be what you enjoy, and the game may change in a way that the thing you found most fun is no longer there. So as a player, I would say go into each new patch or content cycle to look at what it is right now, play it and enjoy it for what it is, but try to keep your preconceptions from the past separate. And if you find yourself no longer having fun, don't force yourself to keep playing. Don't keep chasing the nostalgia of what it once was. Accept that it's no longer that, and move on to something else. And then for developers, I would say, when you plan to change your game in a fundamental way, understand that players don't always know your goal is to improve it. They don't always know the ways in which you are trying to improve it. What to you could seem perfectly obvious as this system was broken and we needed to fix it, to players could be, but I had fun with a broken version of that system and you've taken away my fun. So try to be clear in your communication and be open to player feedback. And if you have a way to make older versions of your game available to players, then by all means do so. Yes, it may cause a split or fragmentation of a player base, but at the end of the day, that's still people playing and enjoying your game. And so if it's feasible, you should absolutely do it. But now I'm curious, what are some of the games you played that changed over time and you fell out of love with them? And have you ever gone back and had a different opinion later? If so, let me know some of your thoughts down in the comments below. And if you're looking for something else to watch, maybe check out the first episode of Worst ARPG Ever, focusing on Hero Siege. Plus, if you like that style of content, get subscribed, leave a like while you're down there, because there's going to be more episodes coming soon. But with that said, thanks for watching, and a special thanks to my patrons and channel members for the continued support. For as low as $1 a month, you don't make videos just like this possible. Link to support is, of course, down below. And with that said, thanks again for watching. I'd love to hear your thoughts on this one, and I'll see you again sometime soon.